My husband was beside me, but I felt more alone than ever. I didn't understand how silence could be so loud, how the stillness between two people who once laughed at nothing could begin to feel like the unbearable weight of 1,000 unsaid words. How someone you used to run to could become the very reason you feel like you're disappearing slowly, invisibly, every day. And I remember thinking that night, not aloud, never aloud, that if I simply vanished, evaporated, dissolved into air or shadow or memory, he might not even notice until his routine was disrupted, until the coffee pot stayed empty, until his shirts weren't ironed, and even then, I suspect his first reaction would be confusion, not concern, because connection had become a myth between us, something we used to believe in like children believe in magic. But now we lived in a house where even our echoes refused to repeat us, where I would lie awake next to him and feel a yawning distance more vast than oceans and galaxies. And the most devastating part was that I no longer cried about it, not because I didn't care, but because the sadness had become my atmosphere. So familiar and constant that it didn't feel like grief anymore, just the air I breathed. And when I smiled at my phone one night, just a simple message, innocent on the surface, but so alive with recognition and warmth. I felt like someone had struck a match inside the cold, damp cave of my chest, and the glow it produced was so foreign, so frightening, that I almost deleted the message instantly, not because it was wrong, but because it felt too right, too real. And I couldn't remember the last time something small had made me feel so vividly seen. And isn't that the most dangerous thing? Not being desired or pursued, but noticed? He was no one important. Just a man I spoke to by accident, a new hire in the department where I sometimes filled in when needed, the kind of casual work friendship that began with shared complaints about the printer or eye rolls about the boss's meetings running over time. And I didn't even remember the first words we exchanged. Only that one day, in the middle of a sentence, I realized I was smiling genuinely, reflexively, without planning or faking it, and that smile felt like a betrayal not to my husband, but to the numbness I had accepted as my fate, because with this man, let's call him M, there was something unsettlingly gentle in the way he listened, not with the polite nods of someone waiting their turn to speak, but with the curious quiet of someone who actually wanted to know, and when he asked questions, they were never the invasive kind. Never prying or too personal, but thoughtful in a way that made me feel like he was paying attention. And God, how long had it been since anyone truly paid attention to me without expecting anything in return, not for obligation or necessity or habit, but simply because they were interested in me? And maybe that's what scared me, not the messages or the conversations or even the way I began looking forward to those brief moments of connection, but the fact that I had forgotten what it was like to feel interesting, valuable, human, and when M remembered something I had said offhandedly about my love for autumn, or the smell of old books, or how I used to write short stories before life got too busy. I felt a tremor inside me, like the tectonic plates of my identity shifting ever so slightly, threatening the fragile structures I had built to survive, and I began to question if I was still the same person I had been before marriage, before routine, before the slow erosion of affection turned me into a shadow of someone I used to admire, and the guilt didn't come all at once, but dripped in slowly, like a leaky faucet I could ignore during the day, but that kept me awake at night, reminding me, with each drop, that something wasn't right, that something inside me was stirring, awakening, breaking through the hardened shell of resignation I had carefully formed over the years. There wasn't a moment, a clear turning point, but rather a series of them. The way I started checking my phone more often, hoping for his name, the way I felt my heart quicken not with passion, but with recognition when I heard his laugh down the hall. The way I started choosing blouses that made me feel slightly more like myself on the days I knew I might see him, even though I pretended not to notice, pretended it didn't matter, because admitting it would mean admitting that something was missing. Something essential and undeniable and slowly becoming unignorable. And yet, I still clung to the belief that it was harmless, that it wasn't real, that I was strong enough to enjoy the attention without needing it, that I could feel seen without being undone, and that belief was the first lie I told myself. The kind that seems so small, so benign, until it starts to grow roots in your chest and wrap around your sense of self, until you can't distinguish between comfort and danger, attention and affection, loneliness and desire. It all came to a head one rainy afternoon. Cliché, I know, but real, when I passed by him in the hallway, and he said something simple, something forgettable like, "Hope the rest of your day is better." But he said it with that tone, that note of real concern. And his eyes lingered just a moment longer than they should have. Not inappropriate, not flirtatious, but curious, and in that pause, in that heartbeat of unspoken awareness, I felt something inside me fracture, not like a break, but like a window opening in a room I hadn't realized was suffocating me, and I walked away smiling politely, professionally, like nothing had happened. But for the rest of the day, no, the rest of the week, that moment haunted me, echoed in my mind louder than any fight I'd ever had with my husband, and I couldn't stop wondering, why did that feel more real than anything I've shared with the man I married in the last year? I told myself it was a fluke, a trick of my tired mind, a projection of my unmet needs, but even that sounded too clinical, too detached, because the truth was, it wasn't about M. It was about me, about how I felt when I was around him. About how he made me remember the version of myself that had dreams and thoughts and value, not because I was someone's wife or someone's mother or someone's assistant, but just because I was, and that feeling, that unbearable, dangerous, intoxicating feeling, was the start of the undoing, the moment I realized that being seen could feel like salvation, even when you know it might also be the start of your destruction. I wish I could say I stopped it then. I wish I could say I took that moment, that glance, that fragile flash of emotion blooming somewhere deep in the cracks of my exhausted heart, and buried it beneath responsibility, beneath loyalty, beneath the hundreds of mornings I had woken beside my husband and chosen the quiet comfort of duty over the unknown tremble of desire. But I didn't, not because I couldn't, but because something in me didn't want to, because the truth, the one I hadn't dared speak even to myself, was that I missed being missed, and that one look from M, that tiny act of emotional presence, was enough to make the cold inside me feel a little less permanent, and once the thaw began, I couldn't stop it, couldn't unfeel the shift, and suddenly the spaces between our encounters began to feel like unbearable gaps, like silences that screamed louder with each passing day. And I found myself creating reasons to linger at my desk longer, to pass by his office more often, to mention projects I didn't need help with just to see if he'd offer, and he always did. Not with fanfare, not with implication, but with a kind of steady, gentle attentiveness that felt nothing like seduction and everything like a lifeline. It started small, the way these things always do, in increments so subtle they seem innocent, the way I began noticing what color shirt he wore, the way my heart tilted toward anticipation each time I arrived at work, the way I lingered just a little longer than necessary in conversations that had no real purpose beyond the way they made me feel alive, and soon, our messages, once sparse and task-oriented, became more frequent, longer, touched with humor, with warmth, with that dangerous softness that only grows when two people are both pretending not to lean closer. And one night, after a particularly draining evening of silence beside my husband, the kind of night where even breathing feels too loud, I found myself replying to one of M's texts not out of obligation, but need. A need I couldn't name and didn't want to. And we kept writing, message after message, about everything and nothing: music, books, childhood memories, random thoughts about the absurdity of office life. And it was nothing really, except that it wasn't, because by the time I put my phone down, it was well past midnight, and I felt lighter, fuller, like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't know was sealed shut, and I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I felt guilty, but because I didn't. That terrified me. I began to measure my days in moments that had nothing to do with my husband and everything to do with the sound of his voice in a meeting, the curve of his handwriting in a note, the way he asked how I was, and seemed to actually wait for the answer, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to change, not outwardly, but inside, in the places no one could see. I laughed more, smiled without forcing it, caught myself humming old songs I used to love before I stopped noticing music altogether, and I told myself it was just because I was rediscovering myself, that it wasn't about him, that he was just a mirror reflecting back a version of me I'd long forgotten. But even that excuse began to rot the more I repeated it, because I knew that if he ever stopped looking at me that way, if he ever stopped replying to my messages, I'd feel it like a withdrawal, and that meant I was addicted, emotionally if not physically, bound to him by the invisible thread of attention, and I hated how much I needed it. I started hiding my phone, not out of fear that my husband would see something inappropriate, but because I knew that even an innocent message, even a line of text about nothing at all, would expose the intensity of what I felt, and intensity is its own kind of betrayal. Not the kind you can prove, but the kind that screams through silence. And one evening, while folding laundry, I caught myself wondering what might say if he saw me like this, surrounded by socks and wrinkles and the dullness of routine, and that thought, that intrusive, vivid curiosity, undid me more than anything else, because it meant I was imagining my life through someone else's eyes, not my husband's, not my own, but his, and the realization that I wanted him to see me even in the mundane, to find me worth noticing when I wasn't trying. That realization was a quiet devastation. It grew worse from there, or maybe more dangerous. Our messages became more personal, edged with confessions we didn't name as such, and I began sharing things I hadn't told anyone in years. My fears, my regrets, the ache I carried around like a secret disease, and he never pushed, never pried, but listened with a patience that made me feel like my pain had weight, like my emptiness wasn't something to be brushed aside, but held gently, and in return, he shared pieces of himself too, vulnerabilities, doubts, little details about his past that made him real, not perfect, not idealized, but human in a way my husband no longer felt, and that humanity drew me in, not like fire, but like gravity, slow and unstoppable, and I couldn't tell where he ended and I began in those conversations, because we weren't flirting, not obviously, but something inside us was tangling, quietly, intimately, in a way that felt irreversible. The first compliment changed everything. It wasn't grand, wasn't laced with innuendo or wrapped in charm. It was simple, a passing comment in the middle of a conversation about something entirely unrelated, and he said, "You have this way of making things feel clearer, like the way you explain things." I don't know, it makes people want to listen, and I laughed, deflected, brushed it off, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding, because it wasn't about the words, it was about being seen, about having someone articulate a truth I didn't know I needed to hear. And that compliment played in my mind for days, looping like a song I couldn't stop singing, and I wondered what it meant, whether he meant it the way it landed, whether he even knew the impact it had, and in that wondering, I found myself rereading our old messages, searching for patterns, for meanings, for signs that this wasn't just me unraveling, that he felt it too, that I wasn't alone in the gravity of this. And then came the second shift. The realization that I was thinking about him more than I thought about my husband, not just occasionally, but as a constant, like background music that plays softly beneath everything you do, shopping for groceries, driving home, cooking dinner. And it wasn't just longing, it was presence, emotional proximity that made the absence beside me feel even colder. And I found myself growing more distant at home, not deliberately, not with malice, but simply because my energy was elsewhere and my husband noticed, not enough to say anything meaningful, but enough to comment in passing, "You've been quiet lately," and I wanted to scream, "I've been quiet for years, you just never noticed before." But I didn't, because I couldn't. Because saying it would mean admitting that I had stopped waiting for him to notice and started wanting someone else to, and that truth tasted like rust in my mouth, sharp and bitter. The worst moment, the one that sealed it for me, wasn't a message or a compliment or a glance, but a dream. A simple dream. We were just sitting on a bench, and I, somewhere indistinct, maybe a park or a station or a library, and we were talking, laughing, nothing more, and when I woke up, there were tears on my cheeks, not because of what happened in the dream, but because of how it felt safe, easy, warm, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that with my husband, couldn't remember the last time I woke up feeling happy, and that morning, as I stood in the shower, the water loud and hot, I leaned my head against the tile and whispered to myself, "This isn't harmless anymore," and yet I didn't stop. I didn't want to stop, because I had already crossed the threshold, not physically, not visibly, but emotionally, spiritually, soulfully, and every time I looked at him, I felt that truth echo inside me, a truth I couldn't deny. That I had come to depend on him, not for excitement or fantasy or escape, but for recognition, for that fleeting, precious feeling of being chosen, even in the smallest way, and that dependence was a betrayal in its own right. One that wrapped around my ribs and squeezed tighter every day, and I knew that even if nothing ever happened, everything already had. It happened on a Tuesday. Not the event, not some dramatic climax or final unraveling, no. What happened was quieter, crueler, more insidious. The crossing of a line so invisible it would be impossible to point to, yet I felt it all the same. Like the sensation of something snapping deep inside your chest even though no one hears it but you. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed that evening, my phone in my hand, the light from the screen too bright for my tired eyes, and staring at his name, MS. Hovering there like a secret I had willingly chosen, like a tether pulling me further away from everything I used to believe about who I was and what I was capable of. And I told myself I wouldn't text him, that I needed space, needed silence. But the longer I stared, the more the loneliness roared inside me, and when my fingers finally moved, typing out some simple, hollow excuse to keep the conversation going, "Long day today," I felt the full weight of my failure settle on my spine. Not because I had told a lie, but because I had wanted him to care. And he did. Of course he did. He replied almost immediately, something soft, something understanding, something kind. And it was that kindness that gutted me, because I realized I craved it in a way that was no longer innocent, no longer manageable, no longer something I could package as coincidence or accident or temporary distraction. And as the words passed between us, words that never crossed a boundary in their phrasing but shattered every one in their intention, I felt the edges of myself begin to dissolve, not in passion, but in a slow, shameful surrender to the very thing I had sworn I'd never need. From anyone else, validation, attention, intimacy, and I knew then, without question, that this was emotional infidelity in its purest form. Not about touch, not about desire, but about presence. About giving the deepest parts of myself to someone who wasn't my husband. That night, I turned off my phone before going to bed. Not to protect myself from temptation, but because I couldn't bear the thought of watching my husband fall asleep beside me while I waited for someone else's words to arrive in the dark. And when I finally lay down, I stared at the ceiling for hours. The silence between us now heavier than any argument could have been, and I wanted to shake him, to scream, to say, "Do you see me at all?" But I didn't, because I knew it was too late, because some part of me had stopped asking that question a long time ago and started searching for the answer elsewhere, and I hated myself for it, hated that I had let it get this far. Hated that the same woman who used to believe in loyalty and vows and choosing the hard work of love was now someone who measured her worth by someone else's attention, a stranger, really. Someone who hadn't shared my life, or my struggles, or my history, and yet somehow saw me more clearly than the man who once promised to know me forever. The guilt was suffocating. It wrapped itself around everything, the way I spoke, the way I moved, the way I smiled when I didn't mean it, and I started avoiding mirrors, not out of vanity or shame, but because I didn't recognize the woman in them anymore. This version of me who had built a double life inside her own mind, a life where glances felt like confessions and messages felt like home, and I couldn't tell where the fantasy ended and the reality began, only that both were starting to blur. And I knew something had to give, but I couldn't let it be me. I stopped replying for 2 days. Just 2 days. And those days were agony, not because he wrote anything dramatic or pressed for answers, he didn't. But because the absence of him felt like grief, real grief, like something had been ripped out of me that I didn't even know I needed to survive, and I hated that I had become dependent. Emotional oxygen siphoned from a connection I had no right to maintain, and when I finally gave in and messaged him again, the relief was so intense it made me feel sick, because in that relief was the proof I had been avoiding. I wasn't just drawn to him. I needed him, needed what he gave me, needed how he made me feel, needed the version of myself that only seemed to exist when he looked at me a certain way, when he asked questions no one else thought to ask, when he remembered the things about me I hadn't said out loud in years. And I think that was the final betrayal, not of my husband, not of my marriage, but of myself. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to fix what was broken between us, stopped reaching out, stopped fighting for the thing we had built over years of shared struggle and comfort and quiet rituals, and started choosing escape instead. Not in the physical sense, but emotionally, spiritually, completely, and even though I told myself 100 times that I was still faithful, I knew better, because you can sleep in the same bed, wear the same ring, cook the same meals, and still belong to someone else, and that realization was the cruelest of all, because it wasn't about what had happened, it was about what hadn't. We never touched. Not once. Not a hug, not a brush of the hand, not even a moment where we stood too close. And yet, the connection between us felt more intimate than any kiss could have been, and I knew that if it ever did happen, it wouldn't be the beginning of something new. It would be the end of whatever remained of my integrity, and so I never let it. Not because I was noble, but because I was afraid, because I knew I couldn't handle the consequences, because I didn't want to admit that I had already chosen, that my heart had already turned its back on the life I had built in favor of. Something softer, something more dangerous, something I could never fully have, and the irony was that I wanted both. I wanted the safety of my marriage and the thrill of being understood, wanted the quiet of routine and the chaos of emotional risk, wanted to be seen without being exposed, loved without being undone. But life doesn't allow for that kind of duplicity, not without cost. And the cost was high. I began to pull away from my husband in subtle, cowardly ways. Shorter conversations, longer silences, deflections when he asked if I was okay, and he didn't push, didn't chase, didn't question, and that hurt more than anything because it meant he either didn't notice or didn't care. And both possibilities made me feel like a ghost in my own home, and every time I laughed at something Am said, every time I waited for his messages like a teenager in the throes of first love, I felt a little more like a fraud, a little more like someone I used to judge from a distance, and I started to wonder if this was how it always happens, not in scandal or seduction, but in these small, quiet betrayals that build over time until you don't recognize yourself in the mirror, and by then, it's too late to turn around. I thought about ending it. Not just the conversations, but the possibility, the idea, the part of me that kept opening whenever he spoke, and I drafted a message once, something vague but final. I think we've crossed a line, and I need to take a step back, and I stared at it for over an hour, fingers trembling, heart racing, and I never sent it because the thought of letting go of that connection, that version of myself, felt like stepping back into the darkness after having tasted light, and I couldn't do it, not yet, maybe not ever, and so I put the phone down, turned off the light, and lay there in the dark next to my husband, who was already asleep, breathing evenly. As if nothing in the world had changed, as if I hadn't already left him in every way that mattered. And maybe that's what hurts most, not that he didn't see it happening, but that he never tried to stop it. Now, everything feels different. Not dramatic, not explosive, just empty. Like a room after a party, the decorations still up, the music long stopped, the silence too loud to ignore, and I walk through my days with this hollowness in my chest, this knowledge that I broke something I can't fix, not just with him, not just with my marriage, but with myself, and I wish I could undo it, wish I could rewind to that first message, that first glance, that first moment I felt seen, not because I want to change what happened, but because I want to remember what it felt like. Before, when I still believed I was the kind of woman who wouldn't need someone else to feel whole. But I'm not her anymore. And I don't know if I ever will be again. The worst part isn't what I lost. It's the part of me I gave away, knowing I'd never get it back.